Okay. Hey everybody, it's good to see you. For those of you who haven't been to previous Haskalah events, my name is Armin. I guess I'm the community's rabbi. And today's session is part of a larger series of adult ed events. The past year, we've been looking at figures, persons in American Jewish history whose influence was definitely relevant and who left a mark on American and global Jewish history, but who are unfortunately very often not so known, or whose lives and legacy is less known than the lives and legacy of other figures in American Jewish history. And today, I have the pleasure to lead a discussion on Henrietta Szold's biography, and we are going to look at some of her speeches and letters and statements to get a better picture of what she stood for. And let us begin. Can you please nod if you can see my screen? Okay, great. Henrietta Szold. At the beginning, we are gonna look at her early life and family background. We are gonna clarify how to pronounce her last name, because I heard at least 3 different versions of pronouncing her last name, but there is only one. We are gonna look at the career of Henrietta in the US, how she got involved in Zionist activities while being in the US, and how the Zionist involvement eventually made her move and immigrate to mandatory Palestine. And finally, we are gonna look at her involvement in peace advocacy. As you're gonna find out, Szold is mainly famous for, this is something that you all know, I assume, for establishing the Hadassah medical organization, but besides, she was also very much invested in a Jewish-Palestinian coexistence, and this is something we are going to review towards the end of our session. But first, as promised, we are going to take a look at her early life and background. So Henrietta Szold was born in 1860 in Baltimore. Her parents immigrated from Hungary in 1859. Her father was Benjamin Szold, and a Hungarian rabbi who belonged to, in the US, people call it conservative movement. Back then, the movement as such did not exist yet, but belonged to a movement of rabbis who were open to biblical criticism, who were open to a scientific study of Judaism, but were more or less halakhically observant, which was a huge difference to Reform Judaism, which neglected halakhic observance already back in the 1850s, but shared these rabbis' commitment to a biblical and historical criticism of Jewish texts. Now, the movement back then was known as Positive Historical School. Many of the rabbis who were involved with the Positive Historical School movement, which originated from Eastern Germany, Berlin mostly, and Breslau, were later founders of the conservative movement. But at this point, the conservative movement did not exist yet as we understand it today. But these are basically the intellectual predecessors of the conservative movement. So that's why all this information about the Positive Historical School and what they stood for. And the solution to my question before, how to pronounce the last name, is Szold, as if it was written with an S. In Hungarian, S and Z together are to be pronounced as S. And very often I hear people pronounce her last name as Szold, which would be the Polish pronunciation. In Polish, namely, S and Z are Esh but in Hungarian it's the opposite, it's S. So now we clarify that. Benjamin Szold's life itself is extremely exciting. He took over a mainstream reform German-speaking community in Baltimore called Temple Ohev Shalom. And the congregation was using a reform siddur, which omitted all the references to Israel, to the Jewish people, Jewish particularism. And these were all concepts which did not resonate with Szold, with Benjamin Szold. So he actually introduced a new siddur in Temple Ohev Shalom under the name Minhag Ashkenaz. Now, Ashkenaz, as you know, is an identity marker for many Jews, but literally it means Germany in Hebrew. So the community was praying out of a new siddur called the Custom of Germany, Minhag Ashkenaz, which was a Hebrew-German siddur, and that was the siddur that Temple Ohev Shalom used after Benjamin Szold arrived. You can also see not the siddur itself, but a publication by Benjamin Szold in German on the right side, published in Baltimore. As you might know, at this point in American Jewish history, a large number of Jews in the country are German-speaking immigrants, recent immigrants who arrived in the US mostly after the 1840s. Many of these German Jews were convinced liberals who were abolitionists and believed in universal freedom and issues like that, which is partially the reason why they left the German states back in the 1840s. The German states were still ruled by princes and kings and all kinds of different authoritarian or semi-authoritarian systems, which made many of these liberal Jewish intellectuals and thinkers leave these Central European countries and states and resettle in the US, where of course there are also many issues, but different kind of issues, I guess. Now, apart from the father, her mother was called Sophie Schar. I don't know much about her, I have to admit. But apart from Benjamin Szold, I wanted to mention a few other members of Henrietta Szold's family who can be interesting for us. Her sister, Adele, was a translator, and I don't know if anyone here knows Maya Debi. Well, when I read that her sister was a translator of Maya Debi, I was very excited because I grew up on Maya Debi. It's a very popular children's fable back in Europe. And apparently the American version was translated by Henrietta Szold's sister. So now we know. And it's not only Adele Szold-Seltzer who left her mark on history, but also Henrietta Szold's other sister, Bertha Szold-Levin, who was an educator, just like Henrietta Szold, and also the first woman to serve on the Baltimore City School Board. And I also wanted to bring up Robert Szold, one of Henrietta Szold's cousins, who was an influential Zionist leader back in the US and one of the early Zionist advocates in America at the time when most American Jews were anti-Zionists or non-Zionists. This is something we covered in previous sessions, but in case you did not attend any of the previous sessions, I just want to wrap up or summarize why the majority of American Jews were anti-Zionist or non-Zionist. Maybe does anyone want to answer the question? Why was the majority of American Jews at this time anti-Zionist or non-Zionist?
The majority of Jews in America were non-Zionist because, number one, in 1859, the Zionist movement wasn't even a movement yet. Number two, even when it became one, American Jews were extremely insecure. You know, they never really wanted to be. They always thought that that would mean that they would have two loyalties, and they would be accused of split, affiliation, et cetera, et cetera. And they were just, given the fact that this was the first country they ever went to that they felt reasonably decent in, they didn't want anything to upset their security here.
Yes, thank you, Yehudi. That is absolutely correct. So first of all, the accusation of dual loyalism, what you also addressed, was definitely one of the reasons why the majority rejected the idea of supporting a Jewish state in Palestine or moving or leaving the United States. There were also many who simply believed that the melting pot will work and that they will be full and equal citizens in this new society to be created in the United States. You might have heard the slogan, "America is our Zion," was a very popular motto of the Reform movement in the 18th and early 19th century. There are all these rabbinic declarations, especially from the 19th century, stating that Judaism is not a peoplehood anymore, that Jews are not a people, not an ethnicity, but just a religious community within the American people, within the American nation. So there are definitely all these tendencies which goes against which go against the Zionist interpretation of Jewishness, because Zionism, of course, believes that Judaism is also an ethnicity and that Jews are a people. Besides being a religious group and besides having cultural traits, etc., we are also a people according to Zionist tenets. So there was this contradiction between the mainstream American Jewish understanding of Jewishness and the Zionist understanding of Jewishness, which explains why the majority was non-Zionist or anti-Zionist. There is a difference here, but let's not take too much time with discussing that. Now, Henrietta Szold, you can see two pictures of her. The one on the top is from her high school graduation picture. After graduating from high school, Szold taught at various high schools and also at Ohev Shalom at her father's synagogue, gave Bible classes, not only for kids, but also for adults, and taught English for Russian Jewish immigrants. If you remember, we went through Russian Jewish immigrant experiences in the late 1800s in previous sessions. About 2 million Jews immigrated from the Russian Empire to the United States between the late 1880s and 1921, which is the largest wave of Jewish immigration in history, 2 million people in just a few decades. And of course, these Russian Jewish immigrants who just arrived in the US also needed courses to facilitate their integration into American society, and Henrietta Szold was involved in these efforts. After her work as a teacher, she became editor-in-chief for the Jewish Publication Society in Philadelphia. I'm sure that many of you are aware of this publication society. They are, very active until today and have been around for more than a century now. She was responsible for translating works from German mostly, but also from French. She was writing articles for journals published by the society and also editing books, overseeing publication schedules. Now, there is one book in particular I want to emphasize. She was the editor of Rabbi Marcus Jastro's Dictionary of the Targumim, the Talmud Bavli, and Yerushalmi, and the Midrashic literature. If you ever go to rabbinical school, that it will be your best friend. That book is something you need to graduate from rabbinical school, because it's until today, that book is the most relevant dictionary, or that one of the most relevant dictionaries, definitely, when it comes to Talmudic Hebrew and Aramaic. And for those of you who are in Pennsylvania, Marcus Jastro was the rabbi of Rodef Shalom on Broad Street in Philadelphia. Yeah, so and a reform temple. Right, and even though she did not graduate from university, I mean, Henrietta Szold was a woman, and graduating as a woman in the late 1800s and early 1900s was a challenge. She was not allowed. She was allowed to attend courses, but not to take them for credit, or not to graduate. She was not allowed to graduate, but she did attend public lectures and also courses at Johns Hopkins and also at the Jewish Theological Seminary in Manhattan. She recalled to have had feelings for one of her teachers. Louis Ginsburg's name might be familiar to some of you. He was a Talmudic scholar, and he was also the editor of the book The Legends of the Jews. Has like, I don't know, a few volumes. It's a collection of antique and early medieval, mostly antique rabbinic tales, midrashim. Yeah, but that relationship was not fulfilled. Yeah, it was not mutual. And she never had any other, as far as I know, relationships. Yeah, but apparently she didn't have any. Now, I promise you primary sources, because I believe that it's much more interesting to read primary sources than to listen to me speak for an hour. This is a letter that Henrietta Szold wrote to a friend of hers, Chaim Peretz, in 1916, after Henrietta Sold's mother passed away. Sophia Schar passed away. And Chaim Peretz made the offer to Henrietta Szold that he's going to say Kaddish for Henrietta Sold's loss. Because, as you know, traditionally women are not required or not permitted, depends on which tradition you read and follow, to say Kaddish for a deceased parent or to anyone, basically. And Henrietta Sold's letter is something where she addresses this issue of tradition versus inclusion of women in the Jewish community. So if anyone would like to read her response to Chaim Peretz, I would appreciate that. Just feel free to unmute and read.
I have it. I know well and appreciate what you say about the Jewish custom. And Jewish custom is very dear and sacred to me. And yet I cannot ask you to say Kaddish after my mother. The Kaddish means to me that the survivor publicly and markedly manifests his wish and intention to assume the relation to the Jewish community which his parent had. And that so the chain of tradition remains unbroken from generation to generation, each adding its own link. You can do that for the generations of your family. I must do that for the generations of my family. I believe that the elimination of women from such duties was never intended by our law and custom. Women were freed from positive duties when they could not perform them, but not when they could. It was never intended that if they could perform them, their performance of them should not be considered as valuable and valid as when one of the male sex performed them. And of the Kaddish, I feel sure this is particularly true.
Thank you, Joy. I wonder, how do you feel about her argument? And what do you think? How did Chaim Peretz react? I don't know, because I don't know anything about Chaim Peretz besides the fact that he was a good friend of Henrietta Szold. What do you think? How did he react, and what makes you think when you read or hear Henrietta Sold's words about women and Judaism and Jewish tradition.
I want to say something if I can.
Of course.
I was in a similar situation when my mother passed away, and I'm probably closer to Orthodox. I'm between conservative and Orthodox, but I couldn't accept what I was being told, you know, that I couldn't say Kaddish, especially that I couldn't say Kaddish without a minyan. And to be quite honest, I just went my own way and I do what I feel is right.
Wow.
So I really do identify with what she was saying.
Thank you for sharing.
I absolutely agree as well. It's one thing if something is performed differently in some different fashion, but there is no difference to me. Speaking or mourning.
And I think it's interesting that her emphasis on the original intention was to relieve women because they had so much on them already that they didn't have to. That didn't mean they couldn't.
Yeah.
Or wouldn't want to or be able to. That's a good distinction.
That's great, Jane. Thank you. Thank you for pointing that out.
And going from what Jane says, it makes me think, as far as my understanding, the positive mitzvot that were time sensitive were the only ones that women had to be concerned about due to issues of being tameh. And it's like, I would hope that people would be able to get to a point of saying, if a woman says she is ceremonially clean at a specific point, that she should be trusted.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Joy.
I'm not so sure about her first statement. I 100% agreement with the second one. There's absolutely no reason in the world why women couldn't take Kaddish for their parents. And the fact of the matter is that in recent years, recent decades, it's become completely acceptable. Even in many Orthodox synagogues, nobody even bats an eye. They set up a special section for the women. Most Orthodox synagogues today have boards ready. If a woman walks in, she wants to say Kaddish, they'll set it up instantly. It's already accepted practice. But the part about where she says that the purpose of saying Kaddish is the chain of tradition remains unbroken from generation to generation. It's a great idea, but I don't think that's really what its purpose is at all. In other words, don't get me wrong. It's very inspiring to read somebody say something like that. Okay, it's the kind of thing that really makes you feel, gives you a spiritual high. But it's, that's not what the purpose is. The purpose is basically that a child has an obligation to the parents, and it's not the training tradition. It's the individual parent and that individual child. It's simply, in other words, here's a case where I find something very inspiring, but I don't think it's historically true. I don't think that's why Kaddish was instituted.
Okay, so thank you for raising that point. I think so. What you're saying is right from a halachic perspective, right? The halakha tells us you have to say Kaddish because it's a mitzvah. That's it. The end of story. But there are agadic stories. There are moral stories also in the Talmud and in Midrashim, which I was referring to earlier, which actually do say that if a child says the Kaddish after the passing of their parents, that's a sign for continuity. And that's a sign that the child will remain Jewish, even though this big tragedy just happened in their life. That is not halakha, of course. This is not a halachic explanation. It's an agadic explanation. But Agada and Halacha, they go together. They're both part of our tradition. So you are right when you say that this is not the real reason, but it's a tradition. It's part of our tradition too. And thank you for raising that point. I didn't think about it, but it's a very good point. Unless there are further comments, I would like to move on because I see it's already 1:30 and I have so many other slides to share with you. So, at the same time as being the editor-in-chief of the Jewish Publication Society, Henrietta Szold also began to pursue Zionist activities, meaning she was involved in the Federation of American Zionists, a representative body of the Zionist activists of the age. And she was the only woman in many of these circles and definitely the only woman leader. You can see a picture of her on the right side on the top, sitting at a table with a dozen male leaders of the Zionist movement and her being the only female leader at the table. It was first in 1909 that she visited Palestine and the Jewish community in mandatory Palestine. I'm sorry, it was back then not mandatory in the Ottoman Empire, Palestine. And 3 years later, she co-founded Hadassah with 6 other Jewish women in New York and served as president of Hadassah till 1926. Hadassah was initially just a project where American Jewish women were sent to Palestine to help the local population. The first nurses to Palestine were sent in 1913, and in the coming years, more and more nurses were sent to Palestine. By the end of the First World War, there were dozens of Hadassah nurses serving in Palestine, and later on it became, of course, hundreds and thousands. But that happened later. And also, especially in the 1920s, after the First World War, during the mandatory period, Hadassah became engaged. The organization became engaged in founding hospitals, a medical school, and all kinds of other facilities that were promoting the welfare of all inhabitants of the territory. I think it's important to emphasize that Szold was a Zionist, and she had a very strong vision of Jewish life in Palestine, but she and her projects, including Hadassah, were also available for non-Jewish inhabitants of the region. And on the right side below, you can see the first class of graduating nurses from Hadassah's medical school in 1921. And I wanted to share with you 2 sources from a speech that Szold delivered in the late 1800s in Baltimore. These 2 passages from her speech indicate her vision for Jewish people and the Hebrew language. Both of these, the speech was delivered before she had ever visited Palestine, but at this time she was already involved with Zionist organizations. And in this speech, I'm not telling you what she says. I will ask someone to read it. Let Henrietta Szold speak for herself. You don't need me for that.
May I?
Yes, please.
Okay. If the Jew is to be transformed into a desirable member of society, it will come about by making him not the less, but the more a Jew, by leading him to concentrate his energy upon his particular inheritance, by having him do not what outsiders, friends, or foes would have him do, but what is forced upon him by the inevitable logic of his past, and having him do that better than anyone else can possibly do it. When that result is achieved, the Jew will be a cultured man and the Jewish people an indispensable link in the Federation of Nations allied for the work of civilization. Such development will be but another illustration of one of the primary truths of our civilization. The truth which by the student of organic nature is recognized as the specialization of function, which the industrial world is embodied in the accepted principle of division of labor, which in the political world has been exemplified in this century in the reawakening of Greece, the unification of Germany and Italy, and the development of the Danubian principles into the independent states. Through the consciousness living in each of its particular endowments, which in the moral and pedagogical world finally is a potent regulative in the form of self-respect.
Thank you, Rachel. Not the easiest text ever, but I think it's very wise, and I think there's a lot to discuss here. So I wonder what are your impressions as you're reading or listening to Henrietta Szold's speech?
That basically what I get from what she's saying is that the best way for us to be leaders in our society is not to hide our Jewishness, but to emphasize that our Jewishness is a part of what makes us especially capable of doing what we do for society.
Great, love it. And I think that's absolutely right. And also, especially in a context of Jewish assimilation, I mentioned earlier the melting pot model, which was the ruling model of ethnic integration in the US at this point. And, you know, in the melting pot, particular identities like the Jewish identity are threatened because it might disappear. Very often it did disappear. And assimilation, of course, until today is a big challenge for our community. And when I read Szold, to me, this is a strong message against assimilation and empowers us to be Jews and to dare to be Jewish. So I think, Rachel, what you just said, that was absolutely correct.
And it's like an early intersectionality where we cannot take away this influence on ourselves and should therefore be demonstrating it.
Great, absolutely. Any other reflections? If not, let's take a look at another passage from the same speech. It's a logical continuation of the first passage, to me at least, but maybe not to you. So would anyone like to read this second passage from the speech?
There is a vast literary storehouse filled with treasures. The key, the Hebrew language, is in our guardianship. Have we a right to throw the key into the ocean of oblivion and deprive the world of the enjoyment of these treasures? More than that, when we have ceased to be the efficient guardians of our treasures, of what use are we in the world? I fear that in the case of such flagrant dereliction of duty, the 20th century will have in store for us not a ghetto, but a grave. At the seeming risk of confirming that Jews cannot be patriots, and at the inevitable risk of calling down upon myself the imputation of narrowness, I assert my conviction that keeping in touch with our brethren is in itself an object. The Jew of Hamadan must be understood by the Jew of Paris and New York, if Israel is to realize his mission. Dispersed as we have the best opportunity, even while proclaiming the unity and fatherhood of God, of serving as a practical illustration of the brotherhood of man. We prayed much about that brotherhood, and in demonstrating our willingness to be brother to any and every man, we as a rule put an ever-widening gulf between ourselves and the majority of our own race. So the anomalous condition has come about that we speak not only of Orthodox and Reform Judaism, but of American Judaism, German Judaism, and Russian Judaism as of wholly incongruous phases of development. As there is but one God, so there is but one Judaism, and that Judaism has but one language, the Hebrew.
Thank you, Liz. So what are we doing, speaking English the whole time? Not the whole time, the services are in Hebrew, but still. I wonder what do you think when you're reading this?
Well,
is really Hebrew our only language?
We're all these dual citizens in different worlds. So, but it is a unifying factor. And I think in general, we need to be more reminded of the things that tie us together than pull us apart.
Great, I love it. It was very Kaplanian of you to say that we are living in two civilizations.
I've been paying attention.
I also think how, for those of us here in the United States, learning another language, being multilingual is often discouraged. And so that is one of those places as Jews that we uniquely have to work against the culture surrounding us.
That is a very important point. Thank you, Joy. Yep. So are we doing enough to promote Hebrew? What do you think? We could do more. I think we could do more. We are trying, but we're not there yet. So does anyone have any further reflections on these two passages on Jews as people and Hebrew as our people's national language or a language of identity, cultural language, however you want to define? If not, there is more. Let's go on then. Life in Palestine. So if you remember, Szold had her first visit to Palestine in 1909, and after returning to the US, she established Hadassah. And in the 1920s, or beginning with the 1920s, she actually spent more time in Palestine than in the US. She made a lot of effort of establishing the Hadassah Medical Organization. So suddenly it was not anymore just a program for American Jewish nurses to go to the land of Israel and support the local population. But she established a whole system which exists until today, the Hadassah medical system. In 1923, she co-founded the Hevra, which was a Reform conservative congregation in Jerusalem, the first one in history, together with Rabbi Judah Magnus, a Reform rabbi from San Francisco. We had a session on Judah Magnus before. In case you're interested, you can look it up on YouTube, or Liz will put it in the chat box.
I'll put it in the follow-up email.
Great, thank you, Liz. In 1927, she was elected to the Palestine Zionist Executive, which was a leadership organization that preceded the Sochnut, or the Jewish Agency for Israel. And in 1933, or starting with 1933, she was co-running the Aliyat HaNoar, youth Aliyah, which rescued tens of thousands of Jewish children from Germany and Austria after the Nazis' rise to power. Szold herself visited Berlin and campaigned for youth Aliyah. And in 1934, she co-founded the Hadassah Hospital in Jerusalem, which also exists until today. And I brought you some selected statements and principles from the first publication of Hevra, of the Reform Conservative Synagogue in Jerusalem, which unfortunately didn't last for very long, lasted for a few months only, but it was the first. And the members were only English, British and American Jews, and they were basically American, following an Anglo-American subculture within the Jerusalem society, and they did not have native Jerusalemites or native Jews, Jerusalemite Jews in their congregation. Soon many members left Hevra. I mean, they were never a huge congregation. They were a Hevura, we would use the word today. They were just a Hevura, but all of them left eventually, and most of them joined another congregation called Yeshurun, which was Orthodox, but modern Orthodox. Would anyone like to read the great principles of Hevra? This is not the whole publication. I selected some of the principles which I thought were more relevant for our discussion today. So Szold was one of the co-founders of the Hevra. Again, that's her connection.
Again.
Jane, thank you.
Respect for and, as far as possible, adherence to the Jewish tradition as to religious services. The Hevra will, however, give its own emphasis to this or to that part of the service. The complete conduct of the services is to be in the hands of members of the Hevra. It is not to be entrusted to professional readers, singers, or preachers. The complex equality of the sexes, the complete equality of the sexes. This is to be expressed as far as possible within tradition. It's complex too, yeah. This is to be expressed as far as possible within tradition, but also in ways that the tradition has not provided for. The Hebrew language shall be the language of the services and the discourses. The general rule shall be, better a poor Hebrew than none. The Hevra will endeavor to point out the present day implications of the teachings of social justice and human brotherhood as inculcated by the Torah, the prophets, and the history of the Jewish people. In order to emphasize the brotherhood of Israel with all of humankind, appropriate selections from the religious literature of other peoples and religions shall find an appropriate place in a Hebrew translation, either before or during or after the discourse.
Thank you, Jane. Would anyone like to reflect on these great principles?
Pretty Reconstructionist.
I think you're right. I mean, you know, this is probably the zeitgeist, like Mordecai Kaplan, when he writes the first Reconstructionist articles, that happens in the same time, in early 1920s. And Henrietta Szold, I mean, I don't know if she knew Mordecai Kaplan in person, but they were definitely moving in similar circles. She studied at the Jewish Theological Seminary where Mordecai Kaplan was teaching. I don't know if she took any classes with Kaplan, but they were moving in the same circles. So if these statements remind you of Mordecai Kaplan, I think, yeah, I understand why you say that. I understand why you say that. But at least maybe you want to elaborate for those of us who didn't come to previous lectures and are not so familiar with Kaplan.
The emphasis on bringing in other religions, other thoughts that have value, the idea of that emphasis on teachings of social justice, our obligations towards the world we have, Equality of the Sexes, 1923. And she's 60 or so at this point, right?
Yeah. She's
So
already 60.
she's
62.
kept moving with the times, because
Yep.
and the idea of the Hever will, however, give its own emphasis to this or that part of the service. That what fits for that community is good for that community.
Yeah, that was great. I could not have summarized it better. I also love the formulation that poor Hebrew is better than none. I will use it. I don't know what context, but I will definitely use it in the future.
It made me think well, the fact that I've been studying that entire time you've been running, I've gone from a biblical Hebrew app now to Duolingo with modern Hebrew.
Great. Yeah.
Although I'm at translating "you wear shoes" into Hebrew, and I'm like, why are there's so many words about wearing stuff? Too many of them, if you ask my English mind.
That's a whole new world will open up to you through learning a new language. So go for it. I think that's a good thing to do. Okay, so I will suggest to move on because we don't have that much time left and there's still so much to talk about. But I really appreciate all your reflections. And I think by reading these statements, obviously we don't know if Henrietta Szold herself wrote the statement, but she was one of the founders of the community, and one can assume that she was comfortable with these statements because she stayed a member and was an active member in the Hevra till the Hevra ceased to exist, as I mentioned before. Unfortunately, after a few months later, then a few months after this was published, the Great Principles were published. So last but not least, I promised you at the beginning that towards the end of the session, we are going to take a look at Henrietta Sold's political activism. She was, first of all, a supporter of a movement against an immediate Jewish statehood. So many Jews living in Palestine were afraid that if a Jewish state is to be established, that will lead to conflict with Palestinians and the neighboring Arab populations. And for that reason, especially Jewish intellectuals, liberal intellectuals like Szold, but also Judah Magnus, whom I mentioned before, and Martin Buber, Gershom Scholem, were organizing against the immediate establishment of a Jewish state. And they were advocating for Jewish life in Palestine, but they were not advocating for the establishment of a Jewish state. And in 1942, members or supporters of Brit Shalom established a political party, which was known as Ichud. Ichud in Hebrew means union. And this political party was co-led by Henrietta Szold. She was serving on the executive committee of Ichud. And finally, I just wanted to read the declaration by Ichud. Again, just like the declaration of Hevra, I don't know if Henrietta Szold wrote anything, but she was on the executive committee of this party. And it is for this reason that I wanted to read this declaration by Ichud and maybe discuss how we relate to this declaration in a post-1948 world, in a world where there is a state of Israel, there is a Jewish state. So how do we relate to the vision of Henrietta Szold and her compatriots or colleagues like Martin Buber and Judah Magnus? Do we have a volunteer to read the text? The 3 points are the most important ones, except for not so. It's okay if someone reads twice.
Hello.
Thank you, Jane.
The Union is not at all an anti-Zionist organization. It is, however, opposed to the present policy of the official Zionist leadership in advocating the establishment of Palestine as a Jewish state. It is opposed equally to the establishment of Palestine as an Arab state. The declaration is as follows. The Union adheres to A, the Zionist movement insofar as this seeks the establishment of a Jewish national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. B, the struggle throughout the world for a new order of international relations and a union of the peoples, large and small, for a life of freedom and justice without fear, oppression, and want. The Union therefore regards a union between the Jewish and Arab peoples as essential for the upbuilding of Palestine and for meeting its basic problems. The Union will strive for cooperation between the Jewish world and the Arab world in all branches of life, social, cultural, and political, thus making for the revival of the whole Semitic world. The main political aims of the Union are as follows: a government in Palestine based upon equal political rights for the two peoples, the adherence of the steadily growing Yeshub and people to a federative union of Palestine and neighboring countries. This federative union is to guarantor the national rights of all the peoples within it. A covenant between the federative union and an Anglo-American union, which is to be part of the future union of free peoples. This union of the free ability for the establishment and stability of international relations in the new world after the war.
Thank you, Jane. Yeah. A lot to discuss, a lot to digest too. So we are just a couple of years before the establishment of the State of Israel, and Ihud was established in 1942, just after the so-called Biltmore Conference. The Biltmore Conference was the meeting of Zionist leaders where they finally agreed to establish Israel as a Jewish state. Till then, there was a division about it. But after the Biltmore Conference in 1942, which was, of course, also in a context of, the Second World War and the persecution of Jews in Europe, the absolute majority of the Zionist leadership aligned with the idea of establishing a Jewish national state. And Henrietta Szold's involvement in Ihud is a reaction to the Biltmore Conference. If anyone wants to reflect on this declaration and what that makes you feel, I would be happy to, hear your reflections, but no pressure. We can also move on. I got a video clip about Henrietta Szold that I wanted to share at the end. So let's just watch it. 3, 2, 1. Okay. So Henrietta Szold died 3 years after the establishment of Ihud. She died in the hospital, the Hadassah Rothschild Hospital in Jerusalem, which she co-established or established, and was buried on the Mount of Olives. And finally, I just wanted to share a video produced by the Hadassah organization in 1946. Just a second. Here it is, almost there. Can you see my screen? Okay, let me know if you can't hear the sound. There's no sound yet.
Of Hitler's Nuremberg proclamation, while stormtroopers guarded the doors, Henrietta Szold stood in a Berlin meeting hall. She had come in the name of Youth Aliyah, the youth immigration movement that had begun to move the menaced children of Europe to Palestine. She talked to men and women whose destinies were already measured in blood. She told them that their children would not die, Sorrowful Jews crowded around her, begging for news of boys and girls they had sent to Palestine at the risk of their lives. They wanted to know if their sons and daughters were safe and well. Henrietta Szold comforted each of them. Her face and voice were their only hope when nothing remained but terror. She went from there blessed by their gratitude. She knew that she would never see them again. Some of those children lived. The first boatload arrived at the port of Haifa in February 1934. There were 44 boys and girls facing a strange and frightening adventure. None was older than 17. They had left behind them the only friends they knew. Henrietta Szold met them at the harbor. In her presence, they found safety. In her eyes, they saw the eyes of the mothers they would not meet again in their lifetime. I should have had children, many children, Henrietta Szold had once told her friends. And here they were. She gave them life and all that goes with a mother's gift. She was with them in joy and in sorrow. She shared their work and their play. Their celebrations were hers. Their victories were her reward. She asked no other. In 1935, she had stood before a Zionist Congress in Lucerne, reporting on youth Aliyah. In that same year, she went to America.
We have already brought out of Germany into Palestine 1,000 boys and girls between the ages of 15 and 17, from a land in which they could not attend school, into a land in which they have fine educational opportunities, from a land in which they cannot pursue trade, into a land in which they are taught trade, from a land in which they are repressed, into a land in which they are given the opportunity of full self-expression. Palestine is, in that respect, comparable to America, to the United States. As in the United States, our young people look forward to a life of usefulness, so in Palestine, these young people repressed in Germany are able to make for themselves a sphere of usefulness, a sphere of noble citizenship.
So thank you all for joining us today.
Okay.
To learn about Henrietta Szold, her life, and
so whatever I'm going to say tonight is only from the Torah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was wondering what that noise was. No, it was YouTube. They just kept playing another video. So anyway, thank you all for being here and for sharing your reflections and experiences in connection with some of the sources, some of the speeches and writings and declarations that we were looking at. That's all. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day. I wish you a good new week, Shavua Tov, and a good new month. Sivan is about to begin, so Chodesh Tov, and see you all soon again at events of Haskalah.
Thank you everyone for attending today. There'll be a follow-up email in the next day or two with a YouTube link. I've also put in a link in the chat if you'd like to sign up for our emails or send a little donation as a thank you to the organization today. So everyone have a wonderful Sunday and take care.